TSA humiliated a black CEO by forcing him to crawl. What he did next turned the entire airport on its head. They made him crawl like a criminal, forgetting he built what they protect. They didn't realize humiliation would awaken something unstoppable. Subscribe if you believe respect isn't given, it's earned through justice. Step aside. Random inspection, said the TSA officer, his voice flat but laced with a strange undertone. Elias Trent paused. He had just placed his leather briefcase on the conveyor belt. Shoes off, jacket folded neatly into a gray tray. The hum of the X-ray machine vibrated softly beneath the floor, a mechanical lullaby masking the unease that had suddenly tightened in his chest. The line behind him had halted, passengers shifting impatiently as they waited for the lane to clear. Overhead, the airport announcement system buzzed to life with a delay notice for a distant gate, but the words were drowned in the tension coiling in the space between Elias and the man who had spoken. The officer, tall, broad-shouldered with a buzz cut and pale eyes that didn't blink often, wore a name tag that read Kellen. His stance was firm, his hand resting just near his radio as if he expected resistance. But it wasn't the command that caught Elias's attention. It was the smirk. "I've cleared federal screening 3 times this month," Elias said calmly, his voice low but steady. "Priority lane." TSA pre-check. "My credentials are already logged." Kellen didn't flinch. "Doesn't matter." Still random. He gestured with a sharp nod to a side corridor cordoned off by a glass wall. "Inspection room." Now, Elias didn't move immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly, calculating, not in defiance but in observation. The smirk, the unnecessary emphasis, the eyes that never left his, this wasn't routine. And the fact that another officer near the scanner, younger and clearly less confident, avoided eye contact confirmed his suspicion. Still, Elias didn't argue. Drawing attention would achieve nothing. With a breath held longer than usual, he gathered his belongings, tucked the briefcase under his arm, and followed the officer through the narrow corridor. The glass walls were meant to suggest transparency, but all they offered was spectacle. Inside, the room was small and overly bright, the fluorescent lights above flickering with a faint electronic buzz. There was a single inspection table, a body scanner, and a cabinet of sealed gloves and tools. A camera in the corner blinked steadily. "Place everything on the table," Kellen ordered. Elias complied silently. His jacket, belt, and wallet joined the briefcase. The younger officer from earlier, his badge read MACE, entered behind them, closing the glass door with an audible click. He looked visibly uncomfortable, glancing between Elias and Kellen like a man caught between orders and conscience. "Shoes, too," Kellen added. Elias raised an eyebrow. "They've already been scanned." Kellen stepped forward. "Do I need to repeat myself?" There was something deliberately performative in the man's tone, something theatrical. Elias could feel it now, the way Kellen's voice carried just enough to reach the silhouettes of watching travelers beyond the glass, how each command was punctuated with exaggerated authority. This wasn't inspection. It was theater. The audience had been seated. The lights were on. Elias removed his shoes. Kellen circled him slowly, eyes scanning with a deliberateness that felt less like security and more like provocation. He stopped in front of him, then stepped closer than necessary. "Now," he said, voice colder, "kneel." For a moment, time froze. Elias blinked once. "What?" Kellen crossed his arms, his mouth twitching into something between amusement and challenge. "Metal implants. Need to make sure you're not hiding anything in your joints." "That's not procedure," Elias replied, his voice calm but laced with a quiet edge. "You're exceeding your mandate." Kellen's tone dropped to a near whisper. "Then cooperate. Or you can explain your delay to federal security yourself. Maybe they'll be more understanding." Elias didn't respond immediately. His heart pounded in his chest, not out of fear, but fury tightly wound into composure. He had spent years building Trenton Systems, a defense technology firm trusted with national infrastructure and the highest clearance contracts. He knew how to detect power plays, knew how intimidation disguised itself as protocol. Behind him, Mace shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the irregularity of the demand but too junior or too afraid to interject. Outside, a few passengers had paused to look in. Some raised phones pretending to scroll but clearly recording. The performance was going public. Elias slowly looked at the floor, then back at Kellen. "Do it," Kellen said again, louder this time as if inviting the room beyond the glass to hear. "If you have nothing to hide, crawl forward." The words hit like a slap. Elias didn't move, but something inside him did, something deep and quiet and sharpened by years of navigating rooms that smiled while undermining him. He wasn't unfamiliar with tests of ego. He just never expected one to come from a security checkpoint. A long silence stretched. Mace opened his mouth as if to speak, but closed it again under Kellen's glare. Elias inhaled slowly, the edges of his vision narrowing, not in fear, but focus. His mind, usually reserved for cybersecurity threats and national defense briefings, was now assessing his current battlefield. The placement of the table, the sight lines from the glass, the location of the mounted camera, the tone of the officer. It wasn't just a checkpoint anymore. It was a trap disguised as policy. His knees didn't buckle, but his resolve did something else, something colder. He bent down, not in submission, but strategy. The moment required patience, control, witnesses, proof. His hands met the floor, and slowly, with deliberate, almost mechanical grace, Elias Trent began to crawl. Behind the glass, someone gasped. Another passenger whispered, "Is that really necessary?" The room, the line, the airport itself seemed to freeze in that moment, and Bryce Kellen, arms folded and gaze triumphant, leaned back against the wall like a man who thought he had won. He hadn't, because Elias's humiliation wasn't a defeat. It was a ledger entry, a debt waiting to be repaid. Some battles start with nothing more than a glance. Elias stepped into the small, sterile screening room, the door shutting behind him with a hollow thud. The walls were glass, clear enough for the dozens of travelers outside to see in but not hear a single word. It was a theater of silence, and he had just been cast in a role he didn't audition for. The fluorescent lights above buzzed and flickered with an unsettling rhythm, casting a pale, unflattering glow on everything within. A tray of plastic bins sat on a metal table to his left, and opposite that, two transportation security officers, one confident, almost smug, and the other visibly unsure. "Remove your jacket. Shoes. Belt. Everything goes in the bin," Bryce Kellen said, his tone sharp, almost mechanical, but with an undercurrent of something personal. Elias hesitated only for a breath, then complied. He unbuttoned his charcoal blazer, folded it neatly, and placed it into the bin. His belt followed, along with his sleek black shoes. Every movement was precise. He'd traveled enough to know the drill, but this didn't feel like protocol. It felt like something else. His instincts had sharpened the moment Bryce first looked at him with that fixed, almost challenging stare back at the checkpoint. The younger officer, Darren Mace, stood a few feet away, fumbling with the handheld scanning device. His hands were jittery. He glanced over at Bryce, clearly waiting for permission to act. Bryce ignored him for a moment and stepped closer to Elias, close enough that the edge of his uniform brushed Elias's shirt. "Now, on your knees," Bryce said. His voice was louder this time, loud enough to carry through the glass walls. "We need to check for hidden metal implants." Elias blinked. For a moment, the words didn't quite register. He stared at Bryce, searching for a hint of sarcasm, some indication that this was a tasteless joke, but Bryce's expression remained solid, eyes narrowed, mouth curved in a slight, calculated smirk. It wasn't a joke. It was a challenge. "That's unnecessary," Elias replied, standing tall. I've cleared federal security 100 times. The silence between them thickened. Darren looked up nervously, his grip on the scanner faltering. Outside the glass, a few bystanders had stopped walking. Some held their phones up discreetly, pretending to check messages, but their camera lenses were aimed directly at the scene unfolding before them. "Then it shouldn't bother you to cooperate," Bryce said, not backing down. He took a half-step back and gestured broadly to the floor. "Let's go." On your knees, Elias felt the heat rise behind his ears, not from anger, but from the sting of something deeper. Humiliation. He wasn't just being inspected. He was being degraded, made into a public spectacle behind soundproof glass for strangers to witness and record. He looked around the room, taking in every inch, the walls, the lights, the reflection of himself in the glass. It felt surreal, like a stage play where the script had been rewritten at the last moment. Bryce's voice echoed in his memory, not loud, but sharp. "On your knees." It wasn't about security. It was about control. The scanner in Darren's hand beeped to life, but he didn't move. "Sir, maybe this isn't," Darren began, his voice hesitant, unsure. "Follow orders, Mace," Bryce snapped, cutting him off before the sentence could finish. A beat passed, then another. Elias took a slow breath. His heart wasn't racing, yet it thudded heavily, like the gears of a machine winding toward some irreversible action. If he protested, they'd claim non-compliance. If he resisted, they'd call it a threat. If he obeyed, he'd feed the performance. And still, there were the eyes, watching, recording, judging. Wordlessly, Elias dropped to one knee, then the other. The linoleum was cold, biting through the fabric of his dress slacks. He placed his palms on the floor, his briefcase now a forgotten artifact on the table behind him. His head stayed high, but each inch forward burned his pride. Not because of the act, but because of the reason. From behind the glass, a chuckle. Nervous, unsure, but it confirmed what he already knew. Bryce had created a spectacle, and Elias was the unwilling centerpiece. "Crawl forward if you have nothing to hide," Bryce called out, louder this time, his words deliberate. A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the outside crowd. Phones were no longer discreet. They were out in the open, dozens of lenses, blinking red. One man whispered something to his partner and pointed. Darren took a step back. Elias's hands pressed against the floor, moving forward, one motion at a time. He kept his eyes forward, never looking up, but he was aware of everything. Every shift in breath, every tap of a shoe, every beep of a phone camera capturing his crawl. When he reached the marked end of the zone, Bryce approached slowly, as if savoring the moment. With an exaggerated air of authority, he pressed the handheld scanner to Elias's back. But it wasn't a scan. It was a push. A subtle shove, just enough to tilt Elias forward, force him to catch himself. That was the moment something inside Elias shifted. Not with rage, but with clarity. The humiliation wasn't accidental. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was engineered. This isn't about policy. It's a trap. A game of control played under the disguise of authority. He saw it now. All of it. The timing. The smirk. The growing crowd. Elias hadn't stumbled into this by chance. He had been targeted. And Bryce wasn't improvising. He was following a script. The chill in Elias's chest disappeared, replaced by a focused stillness. He stopped crawling. His fingers curled into fists for a moment, then released. This wasn't submission anymore. This was calculation. He knew what had to be done next. But not here. Not now. And when he moved again, it would not be on his knees. Humiliation is the favorite weapon of the insecure. Crawl forward if you have nothing to hide. The words hit the air like a slap, sharp and deliberate, loud enough for the surrounding travelers to hear through the glass. Passers-by near the checkpoint slowed, their attention pulled by the scene unfolding behind the transparent barrier. Inside the inspection chamber, Bryce Kellen stood with arms crossed and a glint of satisfaction in his eyes, as though he were an actor in a theater and the audience had just arrived. Elias Trent didn't move at first. He remained on his knees, his palms resting flat against his thighs, gaze locked on Bryce. The cold linoleum floor pressed against his legs, each second of stillness stretching like wire pulled taut. He was calculating, not fearful, but deeply aware of the eyes on him, the phones subtly rising behind the glass, and the smirk that grew deeper across Bryce's face. "Sir, maybe this isn't," Darren Mace started, his voice low, unsure. Bryce cut him off with a sharp, sideways glare. "Follow orders, Mace," he snapped, louder than necessary. His tone wasn't just commanding, it was theatrical, designed to provoke, designed to dominate. A nervous hush settled in the room beyond the glass. Someone coughed. Another passenger muttered, "Is that guy really gonna crawl?" Elias inhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. His heartbeat thudded steadily, not out of panic, but out of something harder to contain. Humiliation. Not the kind that tears down a man, the kind that burns quietly beneath the surface, heating the blood, focusing the mind. He had faced difficult negotiations in foreign capitals, threats to his company, even breaches in global cybersecurity systems. But this was personal and public. He glanced down. The floor was scuffed and slightly sticky beneath his fingertips. It smelled faintly of bleach and sweat, the scent of transit and power imbalance. He could hear the mechanical drone of luggage belts beyond the wall, the hum of life continuing as his own dignity was called into question. Then he moved. First, his hands touched the ground, spreading carefully, fingers wide and steady. Then his body shifted forward, knees scraping against the floor one slow inch at a time. The linoleum was unyielding, and every motion sent a whisper of pain up his joints. Each movement was deliberate, controlled. He wouldn't give them panic. He wouldn't give them anger. But he would give them something they wouldn't forget. Calculated silence. Gasps rose from the spectators beyond the glass wall. Phones came up higher. A woman's voice whispered, "Is that guy crawling?" The click of a camera shutter followed. Another flash. Elias kept his eyes ahead, never looking up. But he saw Bryce's reflection in the polished surface beneath him, leaning back against the table, arms crossed, the image of arrogance. He watched the boots. Bryce wasn't moving. He was waiting, feeding off the moment. "Guess CEOs crawl like anyone else, huh?" Bryce's voice rang out like a slap, thick with derision. Elias didn't respond, but a flash of something dark flickered in his eyes. Darren Mace, standing to the side, had turned pale. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing toward the security cameras mounted in the corners, then back to Elias. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words, or the courage. By the time Elias reached the end of the inspection zone, his suit pants were creased and dusted with grime. The edge of the inspection table loomed just ahead of him. His hands stopped inches from it. His breath was steady, but his jaw was clenched. Bryce stepped forward slowly, pulling a handheld metal detector from the charging dock beside the wall. With a practiced click, he activated the device, a quiet whine humming from its core. "Stay still," he said with mock politeness and crouched behind Elias. Then came the touch. A gloved palm pressed firmly between Elias's shoulder blades. Not hard enough to knock him forward, but enough to remind him who was in control. Or who thought he was. The sensation wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. A hand pushing a man down. Not for security, not for duty, but for sport. That contact was the breaking point. Not a breaking of spirit, but of patience. Something inside Elias shifted. His muscles didn't tense. His face didn't change. But his mind. His mind snapped into clarity like a machine locking into place. This wasn't about procedure. It wasn't even about him, personally. It was about humiliation as spectacle. About using power like a whip. Elias knew this kind of abuse well, not from airports but from boardrooms and briefings, where lies were cloaked in policy and injustice wore a uniform. As Bryce moved the detector slowly over his back, Elias's eyes fixed on the nearest corner of the glass room. Reflected in its polished edge was the faint image of the outside crowd. Dozens now, watching, recording, each of them witnessing something carefully manufactured to shame. But what Bryce didn't understand was that Elias wasn't broken. He was assessing. And with every second that passed, he was building a response. One that wouldn't come from anger. One that would rise from strategy. Because men like Bryce underestimated people like Elias. They assumed compliance was weakness. They mistook patience for submission. But Elias had built systems designed to catch patterns of abuse, algorithms to detect corruption. And now, as the gloved hand shifted down his spine, he recognized the pattern in real time. This wasn't a checkpoint. It was a trap, and he was no longer inside it. He was it. Bryce straightened, standing behind him with a grin still tugging at his lips, unaware that his victory was already crumbling. Elias remained still for just a moment longer, letting the insult settle into the air, letting the sting bloom in full view of everyone watching. He wasn't crawling anymore, not in shame. He was documenting every detail in his mind, building the scaffolding for a response that would collapse the very platform Bryce stood on. And when he finally shifted his weight, slowly sitting back onto his heels, his eyes locked forward, not at Bryce, but beyond him, toward something greater, something inevitable. This wasn't over, not even close. A man pushed too far doesn't break, he calculates. Bryce Kellen's voice snapped like a whip through the confined room. Turn around and stay down. His tone carried the weight of assumed power, laced with mockery. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting cold shadows across the linoleum floor as the tension in the room coiled tighter. But Elias Trent didn't move. Then, without warning, he stood. The motion was sharp, immediate, and commanding. Not aggressive, but deliberate. Chairs scraped faintly outside the glass wall as onlookers shifted. The agents stationed just beyond the door stiffened, unsure of whether to intervene. Inside the room, silence fell like a dropped curtain. Bryce's smirk faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing his face as he adjusted his stance. "I said, sit back down," Bryce barked, stepping forward with a hand hovering near his hip as if to remind everyone he had authority. Elias met his gaze, unwavering. "You've made your point," he said quietly, the calm in his voice more unsettling than any shout. "Now I'll make mine." In one seamless movement, Elias's hand shot out, not toward Bryce but toward the metal inspection table beside him. The flat surface, covered in scattered bins and paperwork, flipped with a violent screech. It wasn't chaotic, it was controlled. A move not made in panic, but precision. The metal legs of the table slammed against the floor with a thunderous crash, sending forms, scanner wands, gloves, and discarded belts flying into the air like debris in a storm. Bryce staggered back, reflexively shielding his face as a cloud of papers rained down. A clipboard clattered against the window. Behind him, the TSA officer Darren Mace stood frozen, caught between protocol and disbelief, his hands half raised in a halted gesture of restraint. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Elias stepped forward. His movements were smooth, like someone walking through a decision already made. His grip tightened on the handle of his leather briefcase, knuckles taut, eyes locked on Bryce. Around them, the distorted reflection of onlookers pressed against the other side of the glass, phones raised, mouths agape, some filming, some frozen. "This ends now," Elias said, his voice cutting through the tense air like a blade. Bryce, shaken but defiant, lunged. His hands came forward in a clumsy grab, more instinct than strategy, driven by the need to reclaim dominance. But Elias was already moving, sidestepping with the reflexes of a man trained to read patterns, assess vulnerabilities, and act with precision. He pivoted on his heel, swinging the edge of his briefcase in a sharp arc. The corner struck Bryce directly across the jaw. The sound was dull and final, a soft, sickening thud followed by a grunt of pain. Bryce's legs buckled. He dropped to the floor in a heap, arms splayed, the expression on his face frozen mid-snarl. Silence followed, deeper than before. No one moved. Not Darren. Not the agents outside. Not even the passengers watching from beyond the glass. The only sound was the distant whir of conveyor belts and the soft fluttering of papers falling to the floor like tired birds. Elias stood over him, breathing steady. There was no rage in his eyes, no panic, only clarity. Behind him, Darren took a cautious step forward, but Elias didn't turn. He looked down at the man who had tried to reduce him to nothing more than a spectacle. And then, in a voice low enough to be intimate but loud enough for every watching soul to hear, Elias whispered, "Respect should never have to crawl." The sound of Bryce Kellen hitting the floor echoed like a gavel in a silent courtroom. For a split second, time seemed to pause. No one moved, no one spoke. Then the illusion shattered. Alarms screamed to life overhead, their high-pitched wail slicing through the tension like a siren in a war zone. Red emergency strobes began to pulse along the ceiling, casting the glass-walled inspection room in alternating flashes of light and shadow. Within seconds, a team of security officers came sprinting in from the adjacent terminal, hands on their holsters, expressions painted with confusion and urgency. Their radios crackled with distorted commands. Level 3 breach, checkpoint 5, suspect is hostile. Repeat, hostile. Elias Trent didn't flinch. He stood amid the wreckage, his briefcase still in hand, the flipped table behind him, and Bryce unconscious at his feet. Debris littered the floor, scattered plastic bins, X-ray trays, forms fluttering like dying birds. A sense of surreal stillness clung to him, even as chaos erupted around him. "Hands where we can see them," one of the officers barked, raising his firearm. Elias lifted his arms slowly, deliberately, his palms open to the air. His breathing was steady, but his eyes flicked across the room, calculating. Every second mattered now. Every movement would be judged. The truth of what had happened, Bryce's abuse, the humiliation, the snap of Elias's restraint was already being rewritten in the minds of those arriving too late. And then, like a break in the storm, Darren Mace stepped between Elias and the guns. "Wait!" Darren shouted, his voice cracking under pressure but firm enough to halt the trigger fingers. He stood with his arms spread wide, a trembling shield of flesh and fabric between Elias and the officers. "Don't shoot. It's not what it looks like." The room hesitated. The tension didn't vanish, but it stalled. Elias met Darren's eyes. The younger man's face was pale, lips dry, hands slightly shaking. But there was something else behind his nervous exterior. Resolve. "You need to go now," Darren said, just loud enough for Elias to hear. "This is already a mess, and they're going to twist it before anyone listens." Elias's mind, honed by years of defense contracts, risk modeling, and crisis management, snapped into overdrive. The logical thing to do, the safe thing, was to surrender, explain himself, let the courts sort it out. But logic had no place in what this had become. Bryce's radio, still blinking on the floor, confirmed what Elias already knew. Backup was en route, and they weren't coming to listen. Darren's hand dipped subtly toward a set of keys clipped to his belt. His thumb clicked something, an override. One of the side doors, normally sealed, buzzed faintly and popped ajar. "Service corridor," Darren whispered quickly. "Maintenance access. Leads under the terminal." Elias didn't waste another breath. He stepped backward slowly, arms still raised until the wreckage obscured the officer's view. Then he pivoted and moved, fast, silent, determined toward the door. Darren stepped back into the chaos, creating space, distracting the others. "He's gone for medical," Darren shouted over his shoulder to his team, drawing eyes toward the still unconscious Bryce. We need to stabilize the officer. The service door sealed with a hydraulic hiss as Elias disappeared into the corridor beyond. The hallway he entered was stark and industrial. Concrete floors, exposed wiring, rusted pipes humming faintly along the walls. It smelled faintly of dust and fuel. Dim bulbs flickered above, casting long shadows ahead of him. There was no signage, no map. Only instinct and muscle memory guided his feet now. Behind him, sirens echoed like distant wolves closing in. Somewhere in the distance, a loudspeaker repeated instructions for a lockdown. The system was mobilizing. Elias understood the full scope now. This wasn't just a reaction. It was protocol. Someone had planned for this outcome, but they hadn't planned for Darren Mace. Elias's breath was tight in his chest, but not from panic, from clarity. Everything in his world had narrowed to a single path, and it led down this corridor. He moved with purpose, ducking under a low beam, sidestepping crates stacked against the wall. His polished shoes slipped slightly on the dusty concrete, but he caught himself, pressing on. Above him, the footsteps of security teams echoed like thunder on the ceiling panels. They were sweeping the terminals. Soon they'd realize he wasn't there. Then they'd come looking here. He passed a maintenance bay door, locked. Further down, a metal ladder led to a floor hatch. He ignored it. Time was too short. A few paces ahead, he spotted what he was looking for. A pressure-locked service door with a red override panel and a manual release wheel. He reached it just as the whir of radios grew louder behind him. Elias spun the wheel, muscles straining. The mechanism groaned, then gave way with a metallic clang. The door creaked open, revealing a sloped passage that led even deeper, the faint glow of sodium lights bouncing off the far wall. He stepped through. Somewhere above, a voice barked, "Where's the suspect?" Another shouted, "Sector 4 is clear, rerouting to 5. They were closing in. He moved faster now, breath ragged, the cold steel of the briefcase handle biting into his palm. This wasn't flight, it was maneuver. He wasn't running from danger, he was running toward position. At the end of the passage, a green exit light flickered weakly. Below it, another door. He pushed through. It opened into a vast underground parking level, mostly empty save for a row of utility vehicles and cargo loaders. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. The air was colder here, metallic, heavy with the scent of rubber and exhaust. And then, headlights. From the far corner, a black utility van emerged slowly, rolling toward him with precision. Elias paused, his chest rising and falling, silhouetted in the glow. The van stopped just a few feet away. The passenger door clicked open. Inside sat a man with a hard-set jaw and eyes like flint, Nathan Red. Elias climbed in without a word, shutting the door behind him. The engine roared softly as the van began to move, and behind them, rising like a ghost in the rearview mirror, was the terminal that had tried to bury him. Sometimes justice doesn't wait for permission. The moment Elias slipped through the utility door, the scent of oil and dust hit him hard. The narrow corridor stretched ahead, lit by flickering red emergency bulbs that cast long shadows across the walls. Pipes snaked along the ceiling, dripping condensation, and the faint hum of the airport above rumbled like distant thunder. Elias's shoes echoed with every step, loud against the silence, but his pace remained steady, controlled, deliberate. Panic was not an option. Behind him, the muffled sound of chaos at the checkpoint faded, replaced by the sharp static of radios and hurried footsteps drawing near. He could hear voices, male, urgent, armed with authority and fear. Concourse D secure. Repeat, secure. Suspect last seen heading south, utility sector. Elias ducked into a recessed alcove just wide enough to hide his frame. He pressed his back against the cool concrete and took a slow breath, exhaling through clenched teeth. The mission had changed. This wasn't about just reaching Capital City anymore. This was survival, exposure, truth, and time was bleeding out. He slipped his encrypted phone from his breast pocket. The screen lit up instantly, the interface minimal, military grade. His fingers moved fast, entering a code that bypassed all verification. The message was short. Extraction required. Compromised at Vanden. He hit send and waited. 3 seconds. 5. Then a soft chime. Route confirmed. 5 minutes. A pulse of relief beat in his chest, but it didn't slow him down. He glanced at the corridor ahead, mapped it mentally. This was a service route, one he'd studied years ago when his team helped redesign the airport's digital infrastructure. He remembered every blind spot, every surveillance gap. His mind raced through the map like clockwork. He moved. Each turn he took was calculated, avoiding motion sensors, ducking beneath camera angles, sliding through blind corners between cargo pallets and mechanical boxes. He passed warning signs, restricted access, personnel only, but they meant nothing now. The real threat wasn't trespassing. It was the story being rewritten above his head. Meanwhile, back at the checkpoint, Bryce Kellen stirred. Blood matted the corner of his mouth, and the side of his face swelled where Elias's briefcase had struck him. His pride ached more than the bruise. Struggling to sit up, he clutched his jaw with a trembling hand and barked into his collar radio. "Code red. Lock down all exits. He's a federal risk." The command surged through the system, lights flashing red across terminals. But Bryce hadn't noticed the slight misalignment on the panel. Darren's earlier override rerouted the signal. Concourse D went into lockdown instead of the service tunnels. By the time security realized the error, Elias would already be gone. Back in the depths of the corridor, Elias heard the buzz of radios approaching from behind. He pressed himself against a steel maintenance cabinet, his breath shallow. A pair of security officers swept past the junction ahead, flashlights casting quick cones of white across the path. Their boots struck the ground like a warning drumbeat. "Still nothing," one muttered. "He's got to be close." "Keep moving." As their voices faded, Elias emerged and sprinted silently to the next corner. His suit, once crisp and commanding, was now streaked with dust and sweat. His hand never left the handle of his briefcase, the contents inside more than just business proposals. It held hard drives, access cards, and evidence the wrong people didn't want him to carry. He rounded one last turn and paused. A faint breeze brushed against his face from the grates above. The underground service level was close. He could feel it. Elias knelt beside a fuse box panel and pulled it open. A blinking light inside confirmed the signal was being jammed in this sector, but only partially. He removed a small chip from his watch, inserted it into the auxiliary port, and overrode the suppression field. Another message flashed on his screen. Uplink unlocked. Visual beacon confirmed headlights. He saw them first, cutting through the darkness from an underground ramp ahead. A black utility van rolled slowly toward him, its engine a soft growl, its windows tinted. The logo on the side read Trenton Logistics, a front company, one he had designed precisely for moments like this. The van stopped. The passenger door swung open. The driver, a tall, lean man with graying hair and an earpiece, leaned over. "Mr. Trent," he said in a low voice, "your ride." Elias didn't waste time. He climbed in, sealing the door behind him just as another siren wailed from somewhere above. The van accelerated, tires screeching on the concrete as it disappeared down the service route. Inside, the air was cool but tense. Elias leaned back, adrenaline still burning through his veins. His mind ran over what just happened: the crawl, the humiliation, the provocation, and now the chase. They tried to trap him. They tried to erase him, but they underestimated the man they cornered, and now they had only minutes before the world found out. When skill meets purpose, even chaos obeys. Elias yanked the van door shut behind him with a sharp thud, the echo bouncing down the concrete service tunnel. He was breathing heavily, but not from exertion. His mind was running faster than his body ever could. Nathan Red sat behind the wheel, already pulling the vehicle into gear, his jaw clenched, eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the winding path ahead. "You just made the national security list," Nathan said without looking back, his voice low and tense. Elias sank into the seat beside him, gripping the edge of his briefcase like a lifeline. The van's interior was dim, lit only by the glow of the dashboard and a flickering overhead light. Pipes and steel beams flashed by through the windshield as they moved through the underbelly of the airport, restricted, labyrinthine, and temporarily theirs. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he stared ahead, not at the road but beyond it, through layers of memory and implication. Images flashed through his mind. Bryce's smirk, the forced crawl, the sting of the briefcase striking flesh. Then deeper memories, confidential memos, redacted reports, veiled threats sent through unofficial channels. A pattern forming. "Bryce Kellen's not just any officer," Nathan continued, keeping his voice even. "He's part of a covert review unit, internal affairs cloaked in national security. This wasn't a coincidence." Elias's hands tightened on the leather. His voice, when it came, was calm but cutting. "This was a setup." Nathan nodded, finally glancing sideways. "Someone wanted you to lose control. Publicly, and they picked the exact moment to make it look like you snapped." The words struck like a blow. Elias leaned his head back, staring up at the van's ceiling, letting the gravity of it settle in his chest. The airport incident wasn't an isolated abuse of power. It was the ignition switch for a larger plan. Something had been orchestrated from higher up, designed to discredit him before he could finalize the capital city contract. "They wanted me to look unstable," Elias said softly, eyes flickering. "Dangerous, unreliable, and if I'd stayed down, they'd have buried me in silence." Outside the window, red emergency lights pulsed in the distance, painting the tunnel walls with a rhythmic urgency. Nathan swerved around a delivery cart, speeding up. "I pulled the traffic feed," he said quickly. "The gate's already closed behind us. They'll figure out the detour within minutes." Elias nodded, pulling out his tablet from the side pouch of the briefcase. The screen illuminated his face, calm, composed, but storming underneath. He began tapping rapidly, scanning for alerts across his company's data grid. "They'll come after the Trenton servers," he said. "Everything I've ever compiled, every contract negotiation, every vulnerability patch we proposed, it's all evidence that we've been too close to truths they wanted buried." Nathan's voice lowered. "You think this is about the leaks?" Elias didn't look up. "Not just the leaks. The ones we exposed made headlines, but the ones we haven't published yet, those shake the foundation. We flagged vulnerabilities in Helio's classified code stack last quarter. If our report goes live, half their encrypted systems are exposed. And their funding dies with it," Nathan finished grimly. A pause settled between them. The van rattled as it passed over uneven flooring, a long, metallic groan trailing behind. Elias exhaled slowly, processing the weight of what he had just said out loud. He closed the tablet and looked at Nathan. "They tried to erase me with one headline. And if I retaliate without proof, they'll call it paranoia. So what's the plan? We get to the hub. Pull the airport's raw surveillance feed. Push it through our own channels. Show the world what really happened. And then," Nathan cut in, "they'll say you doctored it. That you're bitter. Or lying. Not if we leak it through proxy media contacts. International watchdogs. Platforms we don't control. We force transparency." Nathan nodded slowly, eyes still on the road, mind catching up to the speed of Elias's thoughts. "You're not going into hiding." "No." Elias's voice was steady now. "I'm going to make this louder than they ever expected." A siren wailed faintly behind them, still distant, but closer than before. Nathan pressed the accelerator harder. The engine groaned but responded. Suddenly, Elias sat upright. "Stop." Nathan hit the brakes, the van screeching to a halt in the middle of the tunnel. "What is it?" Elias pointed to the side wall where a security camera sat mounted above a service panel. "That camera's operational. It's not connected to airport surveillance. That's ours." Nathan followed his gaze. "You planted that 3 years ago during the network test." "Exactly," Elias said, already unbuckling his seatbelt. He jumped out and ran to the panel, ripping it open and pulling out a hidden storage relay. Inside, a blinking module indicated it had been recording, continuously. He held it up like a trophy. "If the airport feed is wiped or tampered with, this backup still has everything. The crawl, the abuse, my response. The entire timeline." Nathan gave a low whistle. "That's our insurance." Elias climbed back into the van and slid the door shut. "No, that's our detonation switch." Nathan pressed the pedal again. The van surged forward, winding through the last bend in the tunnel. As they approached the final exit leading toward their hidden data facility, Elias stared out the window, thoughts sharpening like glass. His name was already being twisted in headlines. The footage was already edited. But the truth, raw, brutal, undeniable, was now in his hands. He leaned forward, voice cool and steady. "They wanted me to lose control." Nathan glanced over, eyes steady. "And now?" Elias's stare didn't waver. "Now, they'll say you attacked an officer without cause." Nathan's fingers tightened around the wheel, and the van shot into the night. The truth doesn't whisper. It detonates when cornered. They forced a CEO to the floor, mocking his pain and pride under the guise of procedure. If you believe power without compassion is tyranny, hit subscribe now. Justice doesn't kneel. It stands tall. The van screeched to a halt outside a low-slung, windowless building with faded letters that read, Trenton Logistics Hub. To the public, it looked like a standard freight coordination center. But behind the steel-reinforced doors was a private operations facility known only to a handful of Elias Trent's most trusted men. Before the wheels even stopped rolling, Elias had thrown the door open and leapt onto the pavement, briefcase in hand. His polished shoes struck the concrete with precision, his coat flaring behind him like a dark banner of war. He didn't speak. Nathan Red followed close behind, already drawing a small biometric scanner from his belt. The scanner flashed green against the keypad. A heavy, magnetic lock released with a hollow thud. Inside, the facility buzzed with a different kind of life. Rows of black server towers stood like silent guardians, each one humming with encrypted data. The air was cool, dry, and sterile. Overhead, the dim blue glow of UV lights painted their faces in warlike hues. Elias moved directly to the central command console at the rear of the operations floor. His fingers danced across the touchpad with muscle memory born from years of cybersecurity design. He bypassed standard access gates, triggering deeper levels of security until a swirling interface came alive, his own creation, codenamed Argent Lens. The screen split into quadrants, each displaying vital data, news feeds, security alerts, firewall integrity, and external comms. Nathan, eyes fixed on a nearby wall monitor, muttered under his breath, "They're labeling you as violent and unfit for national contracts." He tapped the glass, bringing up a news bulletin. The screen showed a slowed-down, cropped version of the airport incident, Elias swinging his briefcase but without any context. The footage made it seem like he'd attacked without provocation. "They cut the first 5 minutes," Nathan added, shaking his head. "No Bryce. No orders. Just you and the strike." Elias's jaw clenched. "That means they're panicking," he replied, eyes locked on the terminal. "They moved too fast." Didn't scrub the source logs. With practiced speed, he accessed the Vandon International Public Surveillance Archive, footage his company had once been contracted to help manage. It was encrypted, but not beyond his reach. Within moments, the raw data feed came online. Elias sifted through time-coded markers until the full footage appeared, unfiltered and damning. There was Bryce giving the order to crawl. There were the taunts, the crowd, the slow humiliation. Everything. But the file was massive, over 4 gigabytes of high-resolution video, layered with metadata and redundancy checks. It wasn't just a clip. It was a digital bullet, and it needed to be fired before it could be buried. Elias initiated a secure outbound transmission to a dead drop server operated by a cluster of protected media nodes overseas. The transfer bar crawled forward slowly, too slowly. Outside, the faint sound of sirens began to grow louder, echoing through the alleyways of the industrial sector. "They're coming," Nathan muttered. He moved to the reinforced door and slammed the bolt shut, engaging lockdown. Then he walked briskly to the backup station and began loading a series of emergency drives with core operational data. Elias didn't look up. "Redirect all proxies to decoy nodes. We need 5 more minutes." Nathan didn't ask questions. He knew better. The plan had always been built for a worst-case scenario, and today had become that scenario. Suddenly, a red alert blinked across the main terminal. A breach warning. Elias opened the log feed. "Someone's inside our grid," he said aloud, his voice calm but clipped. "Backtraced already?" Nathan asked, pulling up secondary firewall diagnostics. "No, this isn't brute force. This is precision." A moment later, one of the wall-mounted surveillance feeds flickered to life. It showed a live view of the front entrance. There, standing with both hands raised and breath visible in the chilly air, was Darren Mace, the younger TSA officer from earlier. He looked disheveled, frantic, but not hostile. Elias hesitated for just a second, then tapped a key to remotely unlock the entrance. Darren burst through the doorway, chest heaving. He held a flash drive tightly in one hand, like a lifeline. "They're saying you struck him because he found classified intel in your bag," Darren gasped, dropping into a chair. "That's the cover story. They're pushing it through the media now. They're going to raid this place next." Nathan reached for a drawer, his hand grazing the grip of a sidearm, but Elias raised his own hand to stop him. "He's telling the truth," Elias said, locking eyes with Darren. Darren nodded, then held out the drive. "Before they wiped our comms logs, I copied the internal radio chatter. It proves Bryce was receiving outside instructions. This was a setup. They wanted a public incident, and they wanted you to lose control." Elias took the drive gently. His fingers didn't tremble, but something in his chest shifted. Gratitude, grim and quiet. "You risked everything," Elias said. "I didn't sign up to be part of a takedown theater," Darren replied, eyes steady now. "What they did, it was wrong." A faint smile curled at the edge of Elias's mouth. Not of joy, but of purpose, sharpened by fury. "Welcome to the right side of chaos." The transmission finished. A final chime echoed through the chamber. The file had been uploaded successfully. Redundant backups had already dispersed to international media contacts, whistleblower platforms, and legal advocacy groups. The truth could no longer be stopped. Elias stood and turned from the terminal. The glow of the monitors lit his features with cold fire. "Now," he said, "we give them the truth they fear most. Proof." The upload ticked toward completion when the first alert hit like a lightning bolt across the monitors, unauthorized access detected. A red strobe began pulsing in the corner of the screen, accompanied by a shrill digital tone. Nathan Red, crouched over the control panel, snapped upright. His fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling up server logs and command traces. "They've backtraced us," he muttered, jaw clenched, eyes scanning columns of cascading data. "IP range triangulates to the east grid. We're compromised." Elias Trent didn't respond immediately. He stood at the central console, gaze locked on the rotating transfer bar as it inched toward completion. 92%, then 93%. But something in the alert didn't sit right. He leaned closer to the breach log, eyes narrowing. "No," he said slowly, voice low and steady. "That's not a random sweep. That's surgical." Someone knew exactly where to look. Before Nathan could respond, a new feed blinked to life on the second monitor. Camera feed 07, linked to the outer vestibule. The screen flickered, stabilized, and revealed a familiar figure standing just beyond the reinforced glass door. Darren Mace. The young TSA officer was drenched in sweat, shirt untucked, hands raised high in the universal gesture of surrender. His chest heaved with ragged breath, and his eyes, wide, desperate, looked straight into the camera, as if pleading directly with Elias. Nathan's hand went to the emergency sidearm holstered under the desk. "Could be a trap," he warned. "They use sympathizers all the time. He could be wired," but Elias raised his hand slowly, stopping him. "Wait." The tension in the room thickened. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the servers and the faint whine of the cooling fans. Elias watched the screen for a few more seconds, searching the young man's expression. There was no malice, no calculation, only urgency and fear. Elias reached for the console, typed a code, and with a soft click, the vestibule door unlocked. Darren stumbled inside, nearly collapsing as the door sealed shut behind him. He bent forward, bracing his hands on his knees, gasping for breath. "They've spun a new story," he panted. They're saying you attacked Officer Kellen because he found classified material in your bag." Nathan's face twisted. "Of course they are," he spat. "When brute force fails, they rewrite history." Darren looked up, eyes wide. "They're going to raid this place. Any minute now." It's already been flagged as a hostile node. Nathan moved to secure the sidearm again, but Elias stepped between them. "He's telling the truth," Elias said quietly. There was a beat of silence before Darren reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, battered flash drive. He held it out in both hands, not daring to take a step closer. "I copied the internal radio chatter," he said, voice trembling but resolute, "before they wiped the logs. It's all on here, how Bryce was given directives to push you, how they wanted you to lash out. Everything. This wasn't about security. It was a setup." Nathan raised an eyebrow, still skeptical. "And why would you risk everything to bring us that?" Darren's voice faltered but didn't break. "Because I watched it happen. I saw what they did to you. And then I saw how easily they erased it, how they made the lie bigger than the truth. I couldn't be part of that." Elias stepped forward, took the drive, and studied Darren for a long, silent moment. Then he offered the faintest smile, a quiet acknowledgement of the risk the young man had taken. "Welcome to the right side of chaos," he said. Nathan nodded reluctantly, then returned to his post as Elias slotted the flash drive into the auxiliary port. The terminal lit up, validating the files, audio logs, command traces, timestamps, proof, real proof. Meanwhile, the upload bar on the original leak reached 99%. Outside, faint sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The authorities were closing in. The building's exterior sensors lit up, indicating motion at all 3 access points. Nathan turned toward Elias. "We're out of time." Elias's fingers flew across the console, initializing the last command. The media protocol activated, encrypting the upload across 7 offshore servers, each with mirror redundancy and timed distribution. The final segment beamed outward like a flare into the digital sky. Upload complete. Elias stared at the confirmation screen, the hum of the servers now sounding like a battle hymn. The truth was out. Irreversible. Undeniable. He turned from the monitor as the terminal powered down into defensive lockdown. Outside, the sirens had reached a roar, but inside, there was a strange calm. He looked at Nathan, at Darren, then at the door, behind which a world waited with either handcuffs or headlines. And he said without blinking, "Now," he said, "we give them the truth they fear most. Proof." The footage dropped at exactly 8:03 p.m. It struck the national grid like lightning. Uncut surveillance video paired with damning internal audio logs released simultaneously on every major social platform and encrypted media channel Elias's network had access to. The video showed the moment Elias was pulled aside, the way Bryce Kellen's voice shifted from professional to predatory, the command to crawl. It captured Darren's hesitation, the crowd's reaction, and most importantly, the exact second Elias flipped the inspection table and struck back, not in fury, but in calculated defiance. It was clear, unmistakable, weaponized humiliation disguised as protocol. Newsrooms exploded into motion. Breaking news tickers crawled across screens. Exclusive. Airport CEO assault was provoked. New footage reveals setup. Anchors scrambled for context. Talk shows pivoted mid-broadcast. By 8:17 p.m., the footage had been downloaded over 2 million times. By 8:30 p.m., federal agencies were on alert. The narrative, once tightly controlled, was unraveling. Inside a rented high-rise safe house perched above downtown, Elias stood with his arms crossed as the screen played on loop. Nathan Red, sitting at the monitoring console, tracked real-time responses across major networks, his fingers tapping in bursts. "It's out," he confirmed, scrolling through headlines. Every outlet scrambling. Bryce's files being pulled, and guess what? His internal clearance has already been revoked. They're distancing fast. Elias didn't speak at first. His eyes were locked on the screen, watching the moment his knees hit the floor. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. He absorbed it like a scar being branded onto his memory, refusing to let the injustice fade with the news cycle. Behind him, Darren Mace paced nervously, wringing his hands. "This isn't going to stop them," Darren said, glancing toward the windows as if expecting a helicopter spotlight to burst through at any moment. "You think they'll just take the hit? They'll say it was doctored, that it's staged. Or worse, they'll twist it." "They already are," Nathan said grimly. He turned the screen toward them. A major network had just aired a counter-analysis from a retired federal agent, claiming the footage might have been selectively edited. Elias sighed, stepping forward. He tapped the corner of the console, changing the feed to show a press conference now assembling outside the airport administration building. "What they don't realize," Elias said quietly, "is that the truth doesn't have to shout. It just has to be seen." Across the nation, reactions surged. Hashtags like #StandWithElias and #CrawlNoMore began trending. Military veterans, civil rights leaders, tech CEOs, and even politicians took to their accounts to voice outrage. A former senator called it the most disturbing abuse of federal authority caught on tape in the last decade. One influential journalist wrote, "This isn't about a man losing his temper. It's about a system trying to break him and failing." Still, the backlash was not one-sided. At 9:02 p.m., a temporary seizure order was issued for Trenton Systems. Government agents were seen outside one of Elias's secondary data centers, demanding access to hardware under the pretense of national security. The news leaked almost immediately, prompting even louder public outcry. Protesters began gathering outside Vandon International, holding signs that read, "Crawling is not compliance," and "Humiliation is not security." Elias turned from the monitor and paced toward the window, where the city lights stretched like a net of golden glass. The skyline looked calm, but beneath it the machinery of reputation, power, and retaliation churned violently. Darren approached hesitantly. "They'll still come for you," he said, "even after this. Especially after this, Elias didn't turn." His reflection stared back at him in the glass, layered over the shining towers in the distance. "They already have," he said, his voice low but steady. Then he turned, eyes sharp with focus. "But now, everyone's watching." He stepped back toward the screen, where headlines continued to refresh, comment threads ran wild, and the image of him standing upright at the checkpoint chin high, jaw bruised but defiant, became an icon plastered across feeds. "They forced me to crawl," Elias said quietly, "but I stood up so others wouldn't have to." Days turned into weeks, but the world refused to let go of what had happened at Vanden International. The viral footage of Elias Trent crawling on the floor like a criminal, followed by the thunderous moment he stood up and struck back, continued to echo across every screen, every headline, and every government office. Committees formed swiftly, some with sincere intentions, others driven by political gain. National hearings were announced, and behind closed doors, arguments broke out. Was Elias a threat to protocol or a symbol of resistance against unchecked power? Elias barely slept. Each morning brought a fresh barrage of headlines, some calling him a hero of dignity, others branding him unstable, dangerous. Social media boiled over with hashtags. #Stand with Elias trended worldwide, but so did #Secure the Air, a campaign seeded by unknown influencers urging tighter surveillance on high-profile individuals. The contradiction was as loud as the silence of those who once stood beside him. But while the media debated, Elias worked. He stayed hidden in a secure location, a converted top-floor office in a long-abandoned Trenton Systems outpost. The building groaned with age, but inside, it pulsed with encrypted terminals, secure cables, and dim green monitors casting shadows across the walls. Nathan Red, his operations chief and closest ally, barely left his side. Darren Mace, the young TSA officer who had crossed the line to protect him, now worked from the floor below, combing through chain-of-command documents from the airport. On one such night, rain hammered against the wide glass panes as thunder rumbled in the distance. Elias hunched over his console, lines of code and metadata reflecting off his glasses. Nathan leaned back in an aging chair beside him, watching the feed as Elias parsed fragments from airport logs and internal clearance orders. "This command request from Bryce, look at the origin node," Elias muttered, pointing at the string of characters. It was subtle, almost untraceable, but not to him. Nathan scooted forward, squinting. "Encrypted proxy. Governmental. But that tag, that's not standard protocol." Elias didn't blink. "It's not from TSA Command. It's not even from DHS." His fingers flew over the keyboard, decrypting the metadata layer by layer. The rain intensified as if the storm itself wanted to drown out what they were about to uncover. Footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Darren entered, soaked from a quick perimeter check, clutching a flash drive in one hand. "You're gonna want to see this," he said, voice tight. He plugged the drive into the secondary terminal. "This is a copy of Bryce's personal clearance log from that morning. I had to backdoor it through the airport's legacy system. Took me hours." The file loaded slowly, and then it hit them all at once, an encrypted command trail routing back to a system registered under the name Helios Division. Elias stood up, his spine straightened like a wire pulled taut. "Helios," he whispered. Nathan frowned. "That name again. We've heard rumors for years. A private intel contractor. Dirty contracts. Black budget operations. They do the jobs no one wants to admit exist." Elias nodded slowly, his voice low, precise. "And they're backed by the same bureaucrats that stalled our last bid. The same people who wanted us gone." His mind raced, connecting dots. It wasn't just about humiliating me. It wasn't just about the airport. This was a takedown strategy. Public, loud, and deniable. Darren's mouth fell slightly open. "You think this was corporate sabotage?" "No," Elias replied coldly. "I know it was." The room fell silent except for the sound of the rain tapping glass like impatient fingers. Elias walked slowly to the window, staring out at the stormlit skyline. His reflection stared back at him, gaunt but resolute. "They couldn't beat us with better tech. So they tried to bury me under scandal." Nathan stood beside him, voice rough. Then we expose it all. Not just Bryce, not just the airport. We go after Helios. Elias turned. His face, once worn by stress, now sharpened with purpose. We won't just clear my name, he said. We dismantle the entire system that let this happen. And how exactly do we do that? Darren asked, glancing between them. Evidence, Elias said. We keep digging. We follow every transmission, every handoff, every code trace. We give them no room to deny it. Nathan nodded grimly. We'll need to act fast. Once they realize we're onto them, they'll strike again, Elias finished for him, but this time, we're ready. Darren looked at the screen, at the glowing name Helios Division, and whispered, "They thought they were invisible." Elias's eyes narrowed. "Then let's show them what it feels like to be seen." The lights dimmed as the server adjusted to a new security routine. Outside, the storm began to break, but inside, the pressure only grew. Elias sat back at the terminal, fingers moving with precision, every keystroke a promise. Nathan watched him, then looked down at the screen one more time. "This is going to blow wide open," he said. Elias didn't look up. "Good," he replied. "Justice doesn't sleep. It just waits for the right proof to wake it." The doors to the inquiry chamber swung open with a mechanical groan, silencing the low murmur of the audience. All heads turned as Elias Trent stepped inside, flanked by two silent aides and carrying nothing but a sleek black tablet under one arm. His posture was upright, controlled, the very image of someone who refused to be bowed by what the world had seen weeks earlier. Reporters clustered behind the barricades of the media box, cameras capturing every step, every glance. A flashbulb lit the room with each second. Behind the elevated bench, the chairman of the Oversight Committee tapped his gavel once. "Mr. Trent," the chairman began, voice stern but curious, "are you aware that appearing today goes directly against your legal counsel's recommendation?" "I'm aware," Elias said calmly, his voice steady, carrying easily across the chamber. There was something about the way he said it, measured, precise, that made even the most skeptical senators lean forward. He approached the witness table without ceremony, set the tablet down, and plugged a slim connector into the chamber's public display console. The chairman cleared his throat. "You're here to respond to accusations of violent misconduct during the airport incident. Do you have a statement before we begin questioning?" Elias nodded once. "You've all seen the video they wanted." He tapped the tablet. "Now watch the one they didn't." The screen behind the bench came to life, drawing immediate attention. First came the familiar footage, edited, cropped, the viral moment of Elias striking TSA officer Bryce Kellen, followed by a sharp cut to his hasty departure. Some on the committee shifted, prepared to reinforce their judgment. But then the screen flickered. A new angle appeared, raw, time-stamped, unedited security footage. It began not with violence, but with humiliation. The room watched in uncomfortable silence as Bryce barked orders, forced Elias to his knees, made him crawl. Gasps broke out when Bryce's gloved hand shoved Elias's back. Murmurs turned into outrage as the camera zoomed in on Bryce's mocking smirk and the deliberate spectacle of the ordeal. The footage didn't stop there. Next came an overlay, time-stamped audio logs. The voice was unmistakably Bryce's, receiving orders via encrypted radio. Elias tapped again. A new window opened. This time a communication log sourced from the Helios Division's internal systems. Names, timestamps, directive codes. Orders traced directly to covert operators embedded within airport security review teams. One message stood out in bright red text. Target Trent. Apply humiliation protocol. Capture reaction. The room erupted. Senators shouted over each other, some calling for immediate suspension of the hearing, others demanding arrests. Elias remained seated, hands folded, unmoved by the noise. Nathan Red, watching from the side row, exchanged a quick glance with Darren Mace, who sat 2 rows behind, tense but satisfied. The plan had worked. The chairman slammed the gavel again, voice raised over the clamor. "Order! This hearing will maintain order." Elias stood slowly. All eyes returned to him. The chaos around him fell quiet as he faced the committee. His voice was even, almost cold. If a man can be forced to crawl in public, imagine what truth they can bury in private. For a moment, no one moved. The cameras kept rolling, frozen on Elias's face. Somewhere in the control room, a technician whispered that every outlet had picked up the feed. The footage had already gone viral again, this time with a different ending. Within hours, Helios Division was placed under investigation for federal misconduct. The moment truth walked in, deception had to stand. The coffee was bitter, but Elias Trent didn't flinch. He held the ceramic cup steady in his hand, elbows resting on the cool metal table outside the cafe as morning traffic hummed softly in the distance. Across the street, the newly rebuilt Vanden International Airport gleamed under the early sun, glass towers reflecting the world back in sharp angles. Travelers moved like ants beyond the wide windows, wheeling luggage, hugging goodbyes, sipping overpriced espresso. None of them looked in his direction, and that was just how Elias preferred it. He shifted slightly in his seat, the corner of his dark overcoat brushing against the table's edge. The scar above his right eyebrow, faint but permanent, tightened as he squinted into the light. He remembered that floor, that linoleum, the way it chilled his palms when they made him crawl. They'd tried to break him in front of the world, to reduce a man to a moment. But moments passed, and men endured. "Mr. Trent?" The voice startled him, just enough to draw his gaze. A young man stood nearby, early 20s maybe. Nervous hands clutched a small notepad and his messenger bag was slung awkwardly across one shoulder. His tie was crooked, his collar stiff. Elias didn't recognize him. The man cleared his throat. I'm Theo Marsh, with New Verge Weekly. I've tried reaching out for weeks. They said you sometimes come here." Elias stared for a beat too long, then nodded to the empty chair across from him. "Sit." Theo obeyed quickly, fumbling for a pen. "I won't take much of your time. I know you've avoided interviews since the inquiry, but—" "You want a quote?" Elias interrupted, setting his cup down gently. "A sound bite to tie the bow." Theo hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but also more than that. People still talk about that footage, about the hearings, about how you walked into that room with proof and walked out having burned down an empire." Elias said nothing. The breeze lifted a folded napkin off the table. He caught it with one hand and tucked it beneath his saucer. Theo leaned in. "You changed everything. Security protocol, federal oversight, corporate transparency. Even Helios was dismantled. You could have run for office if you wanted." "I never wanted a podium," Elias replied, his voice low but steady. "Just a floor I didn't have to crawl across." Theo scribbled quickly, eyebrows furrowed. "Do you ever regret it?" "The fight, I mean. The fallout." A long silence passed. Elias turned his head slightly, watching a father adjust his son's backpack near the bus stop. The boy laughed, swinging his arms wide like an airplane. "I regret nothing," Elias said finally, voice measured. "But regret only belongs to silence." Theo looked up from his notes. "What do you mean?" Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood slowly, sliding his chair back with a soft scrape against the pavement. He straightened his coat, brushing invisible lint from his sleeve. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring across at the terminal that had once tried to bury him beneath shame. He hadn't stepped inside that building since the incident. Not since the day Bryce Kellen's voice, smug and venomous, echoed across glass and tile, trying to brand him as less. Not since the day the nation watched a man be broken, only to rise higher than his enemies ever imagined. The wind picked up slightly, tousling the edges of the newspaper left on the adjacent table. A headline was half visible: "Ethics Board to expand whistleblower protections." Elias exhaled slowly, then turned to Theo, who now looked unsure whether to follow or speak again. "You've got your quote," Elias said softly, nodding toward the notepad. Theo blinked. That was it. A faint smile touched Elias's lips. Sometimes the quiet ones echo. Longest. He stepped away from the table. The street buzzed around him. The terminal loomed in the background, a monument to both betrayal and rebirth. Travelers walked by, unaware, unbothered, and that, in itself, was victory. As he crossed the narrow street, the rising sun reflected off a nearby taxi windshield, briefly blinding him. He raised one hand against the glare, and for a moment, his own reflection flashed back in the mirrored airport doors, a man defined not by what had been done to him, but by what he did in return. He paused just once before continuing, and as the cafe receded behind him, his voice carried on the wind, quiet but firm. "They wanted to break my body," he murmured, "but all they did was strengthen my spine. They tried to strip a man of dignity and found themselves face down in their own shame. If you believe the strong rise against abuse, subscribe now, because justice always stands back up. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, power abuse, and the moment a man reclaims his dignity in the face of humiliation. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and spark reflection on justice, equality, and the importance of standing up against systemic disrespect."